This is your home, and this is your family.
Cowboy was given a Cheyenne girl as a cruel joke, but what she said next made his blood run hot. An 1,880 story begins, where the Arizona sky burns hot under the glaring sun, and every grain of sand carries the whisper of an old curse. He let out a harsh laugh that sounded like shattered gravel under a horse's hooves. "Here's the payment for your debt," he said, smirking, his eyes fixed on the house like a wolf sniffing out its prey. Wyatt's face was a rigid shield, devoid of any expression. He stood on the porch, staring at the barren land in front of him, and at the woman standing next to the man's horse. She was small, thin, and seemed to be shackled by fatigue, as if she no longer had the strength to stand upright. Her eyes were fixed on the rotten wooden planks beneath her feet, as if that was the only thing solid in a shattered world. Let's listen to a Wild West love story. A cowboy love stories that we believe will change destinies. If you love Wild West stories like this, please comment with lots of number ones and let us know where you're from. In a small town with a name that sounds like a sighed dust hollow, where time moves as slowly as a dead clock, one man's life has become a repeating ballad of loss. Former Sheriff Wyatt Stone lives in a house where every corner is imprinted with the ghost of his late wife, Eleanor. The wind howling through the cracks in the wooden walls sounds like a lament. His loneliness isn't a choice. It's a debt that has come due. But some debts can't be paid with money or hard labor. They are paid in flesh and blood. It was a somber afternoon, as the sun was setting in a fiery red, when a man on horseback arrived, followed by a woman with a haggard, fragile appearance, a silent shadow. He was Cain Thorne, known as the Vulture, a name that would make even a real vulture shudder. He presented the woman as a commodity, proof that a debt had been settled. He let out a harsh laugh that sounded like shattered gravel under a horse's hooves. "Here's the payment for your debt," he said, smirking, his eyes fixed on the house like a wolf sniffing out its prey. He tried to hide himself, to forget the world, but the world still found him. Eleanor's death had turned him into a distant, solitary man. Wyatt's face was a rigid shield, devoid of any expression. He stood on the porch, staring at the barren land in front of him, and at the woman standing next to the man's horse. She was small, thin, and seemed to be shackled by fatigue, as if she no longer had the strength to stand upright. Her eyes were fixed on the rotten wooden planks beneath her feet, as if that was the only thing solid in a shattered world. Cain Thorne, a cruel man, always found a way to pry at the deepest pains of others. He knew Eleanor's death was an open wound in Wyatt's heart. He began to say sarcastic things, like poisonous needles, stabbing into his heart. "I figured a widower like you needs someone to warm his bed," he sneered. "This one's even better than the last, quieter." He deliberately mentioned Eleanor, intentionally poking at Wyatt's pain, but Wyatt didn't respond. Wyatt just stood there, motionless. The sun and his grief had carved his face into a mask of stoicism. He silently watched Cain ride away, leaving the small woman standing alone with her dirty cloth sack. Since Eleanor's death from a fever 2 years ago, Wyatt's heart had become a locked room. The silence she left behind was a physical presence, an invisible weight pressing down on the entire ranch, stifling the laughter of his 2 small children, Jimmy and Daisy, and withering the herb garden that Eleanor had once cherished. Now, a new silence, a new woman, stood before him. Wyatt was an upright man. He had been a good sheriff. He could not accept a human being being treated like property. That thought made him sick. But the thought of leaving her alone on the prairie, or worse, letting her fall victim to someone like Cain, was a greater sin. He slowly stepped down from the porch, his boots thudding against the dry ground, one step at a time. He stopped a few feet away from her. She didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the rotten wooden planks beneath his feet, as if that was the only thing solid in a shattered world. Wyatt was a burly man, and his loneliness had made him seem even larger. From inside the house, 2 small faces, miniature replicas of his own cautious expression, watched through the dirty window. The children were another reason he couldn't turn his back on this woman. He cleared his throat, the dry sound echoing in the silent air. He didn't point to the main door, where he and his children lived. He pointed to the small shack on the side of the house, a place that had long been abandoned. "Over there," he said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a demarcation of boundaries, a statement of fact. Then he turned his back and walked into the house. The sound of the wooden door slamming shut was the only thing he could say to her. For the first while, they lived like two ghosts. The woman, Ayanna, moved through his world like an apparition. She stayed in the empty little shack he had pointed to, a space with only an old bed and a bucket for a table. She never entered the main house unless he was away working on the distant fences. When he was gone, she would quietly slip in, clean away the layers of dust that sealed his pain, wash the children's clothes, and fold them neatly, like a silent, anonymous gift. When Wyatt returned, he would always smell the scent of herbal soap, where before there was only the smell of old sadness, a little bit of order in the chaos of forgetfulness. He and the children ate in a tense silence at the main table. He would leave a plate of food for her on the porch railing, and the next morning the plate would be gone, washed clean, and returned to its spot. They were two lost souls in the same house, orbiting a core of loneliness that no one would admit. Jimmy and Daisy were silent observers. They watched her from behind the barn, their wide, serious eyes following her every move. Ayanna never approached them, never offered a smile or a word. She respected their fear, the fierce loyalty they held for their mother's memory. She understood invisible walls. Hers were built of things harder than wood and stone. One afternoon, Wyatt saw her standing in front of Eleanor's withered herb garden through the window. It was a patch of ground surrounded by dry thorns and death, a perfect monument to his own withered heart. He hadn't touched it since Eleanor died. He couldn't bear to. But Ayanna stood there for a long time, her small figure motionless against the persistent wind. She wasn't looking at the dead bushes, but at the dry, cracked soil, her head tilted as if listening to a story only she could hear. He felt a surge of protective anger. That was Eleanor's place. It was sacred ground. He thought she would turn away, but she didn't. Instead, she knelt, her hands gently running over the cracked, cold, and unforgiving earth. For a moment, he thought she might cry, and the unfamiliar thought startled him. But she didn't cry. She just stayed there, like a sentry at the grave of a stranger's love. The next morning, she began her work. With her bare hands, she started pulling out the dry weeds, each motion slow and deliberate. Wyatt watched from a distance, his hands clenched tightly around the handle of an axe. Every weed she pulled felt like an intrusion, a desecration of sacred ground. He told himself he should stop her, tell her to leave things as they were, that some things were meant to stay broken forever. But he remained silent, a prisoner of his own indifference. The children also watched, their initial suspicions slowly turning into a quiet curiosity. They had seen what he had seen. She wasn't destroying the memory of the garden, she was performing a final rite for it. She cleared away what was dead with a reverence that dissolved his anger, piling them neatly to one side. Then, she began to turn the soil with a sharp piece of metal she must have found in the shed. It was hard work. The ground was as hard as iron. Yet she persisted, day after day, under the harsh, relentless sun. She wasn't just tending a plot of land, she was digging hope from a place that was utterly hopeless. Ayanna wasn't just digging soil. She was speaking to something buried deep, something that answered only in silence. That night, under a pale moon that hung low like a shard of bone, Ayanna sat by the garden with her hands still stained in dirt. Her fingers pressed into the earth not like a farmer, but like someone laying hands on a heartbeat. In a whisper only the wind could carry, she began to murmur in Cheyenne a prayer her mother used to say when tending their medicine patch before the soldiers burned it all down. Wyatt stood just out of sight, near the barn, the shadows swallowing his outline. He didn't understand her words, but the tone, low, rhythmic, sacred, cut through him. There was something in it that reminded him of Eleanor's lullabies. It wasn't English, but it was familiar in a way grief always is. The next morning, he didn't say anything, but he rebuilt the old fence around the garden. His hands, rough and calloused, replaced every broken plank one by one. Ayanna saw him. She didn't speak either. She just kept working, slower that day, more precise. They didn't make eye contact, but their silence had changed shape, no longer avoidance, but acknowledgement. That was the first day they started to share the garden. That was a language Wyatt understood better than words. It was the language of relentless, thankless labor, of pushing back against an unfeeling land, and from it, finding a reason to keep living. He saw the sweat on her brow, the soil deep in the creases of her hands, and for the first time, he didn't see a Cheyenne woman or a burden, but a survivor just like him. One evening, he found one of his shirts, neatly folded, on his bed. It was his favorite shirt, worn and torn at the elbow from catching on a barbed wire fence. He had intended to throw it away, but she had brought it back. The tear wasn't just mended, it was patched with a delicate artistry, with stitches he had never seen before. In the middle of the patch, woven with threads she must have unraveled from her meager belongings, was a small, subtle embroidery of a native wildflower. It was strangely beautiful, a small, defiant act of creation on old, faded cloth. He ran his calloused finger over the stitches. It was a message. I am not just a burden. I have skills. I have a name. I have a past. He wore the shirt the next day, and though he didn't express his gratitude, he felt her eyes follow the mended fabric, a fleeting connection, almost imperceptible. The soil began to soften under her hands. The long parched ground began to breathe again. Every day, Wyatt would change his route home, just to pass by the garden, to see its slow, miraculous transformation. He told himself it was foolish, that nothing could grow there anymore. But a part of him, a part he thought had long died, felt a flicker of anticipation. He began leaving a fresh bucket of well water near the plot every morning before he rode off. He never saw her use it, but every evening the bucket would be empty, and the soil would be a dark, rich brown. It was a silent dialogue, a quiet partnership over this small, hopeful piece of land. The children were the first to break the invisible barrier. One hot afternoon, as she worked, Daisy, his daughter, tiptoed toward the garden. She stopped a few feet away, her hand tightly clutching something. For a long moment, she just stood there, like a brave little soldier. Then, she opened her hand and held out a rusty trowel, one of Eleanor's old gardening tools she had found. She didn't say a word, just offered the trowel. Ayanna stopped working and looked at the child, then at the trowel. She slowly wiped her hands on her skirt and took the trowel, her fingers brushing Daisy's in a fleeting moment. It was their first touch. Jimmy, always his father's shadow, appeared from behind the water trough, holding a handful of dried seeds he'd found in the shed. He offered them to her, too. She accepted them with a solemn nod, a soft, fragile light passing through her eyes. That evening, the atmosphere in the house felt different. The silence was less heavy, less oppressive. Wyatt served stew at the table, a familiar, quiet ritual. But this time, it was broken. Her voice, when it came, was very small, but it filled the room low and clear, without a trace of the subservience he had expected. "My name is," she said, looking him straight in the eye for the first time, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Ayanna." His spoon stopped mid-air. The name hung in the air, something with weight and meaning. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration, a reclamation. In that moment, she was no longer the debt, a ghost, a burden. She was a person with a name, a will that had survived hell. He felt a profound, unsettling shift inside, as if a foundation had been shaken. He had given her a home, but as he watched her disappear into the darkness, he wondered if he was just burying a new ghost in his own graveyard. The house, once a rotten wooden monument to pain and loneliness, was now slowly coming back to life. It still had the old wooden walls and creaking floorboards, but now there was a subtle change. One afternoon, when the sunlight streamed through the dirty window, Wyatt returned not to a house steeped in heavy silence, but to a space that smelled of herbal soap, of a fragrant scent he had never known. It wasn't the smell of a deceased woman, but the smell of new life, quiet and resilient. Wyatt slowly walked into the house. His shirt, with the torn elbow, was neatly folded on the bed. The tear wasn't just clumsily mended, It was repaired with small, intricate stitches, as if woven from the threads of a wildflower. Wyatt picked up the shirt, his rough fingers touching the stitches, feeling the meticulousness, the patience. It was like a silent message, a story she had told with her hands. He couldn't put it into words, but he understood. He wore that shirt the next day, and though he didn't voice his gratitude, he felt her eyes follow the mended fabric, a fleeting, almost imperceptible connection. The children were changing, too. At first, they were shadows of suspicion, peeking from behind the door, watching Ayanna with cautious eyes. But curiosity is a plant that grows faster than fear. They started following Ayanna when she went into the garden. This was the barren plot that Eleanor had once cultivated, but since her death, it had become a symbol of decay. To the children, the garden was forbidden ground, where sad memories were buried. But Ayanna, somehow, had turned it into a land of hope. She didn't use gardening tools, only her bare hands, calloused yet gentle. She pulled out the dead weeds, cleared the wild thorns, every gesture purposeful. Ayanna worked as if she was conversing with the land, as if listening to stories only she could hear from the dry, dusty grains. One afternoon, Wyatt walked by and saw Ayanna holding a rusty trowel he had planned to throw away, and a handful of old seeds Jimmy had found in the shed. She wasn't just turning the soil, she was planting something in the earth, something he couldn't name. Her actions had captured the children's attention. Jimmy and Daisy had approached Ayanna. They said nothing, but their presence was an invitation. For the first time, Ayanna smiled at them, a fragile smile like a wildflower. She nodded, and they understood. They sat down beside her, giving her stones and ceramic shards they had collected to decorate the garden. It wasn't a conversation of words, but a dialogue of the heart, where silence contained all the trust and compassion. The next morning, the sunlight poured gently over the horizon like honey, warm and golden. Jimmy and Daisy were already in the garden by the time Ayanna stepped outside, her skirt brushing the new shoots that had sprung up like little green miracles. She carried with her a small woven pouch, made from bark fiber and cloth, one of the few things she had brought from her old life. Inside the pouch were dried herbs, old roots wrapped in paper, and fragments of knowledge passed down through generations of Cheyenne women. She didn't speak much that morning, but the children followed her naturally, like bees to blossoms. There was no command, no instruction, just invitation in the way she moved, in the way she looked at the land. She knelt by a patch of flowering yarrow, the plant's pale yellow heads bobbing gently in the breeze. With care, she plucked a few leaves and held them out. "This one," she said softly, "stops bleeding." Jimmy squinted. "Like bandages?" "Better," Ayanna replied, smiling faintly. "Nature's bandage. Mash the leaves, press them on a cut. Keeps the bad spirits out." Daisy leaned in closer, wide-eyed. "What kind of bad spirits?" Ayanna tapped the side of her nose. "The kind you can't see. The ones that crawl into wounds when you're not looking." The children laughed, but with a hint of reverence. Then Ayanna unrolled a strip of cloth and pulled out a mortar and pestle carved from smooth stone. She placed it on a flat rock beside them, motioned for Daisy to help. "Here," she said, "you try." Daisy looked unsure but placed the leaves in the bowl and began to grind. Her small hands moved awkwardly at first, but Ayanna corrected her gently, guiding her fingers. "Use your whole arm, not just the wrist. Like this," she demonstrated. Jimmy watched quietly, then picked up a few sprigs of mint and held them to his nose. "Smells like ma," he whispered, almost too softly to hear. Ayanna paused, but didn't ask him to explain. She didn't need to. Later that morning, she showed them how to make a salve using beeswax melted over the stove, mixed with lavender and comfrey. The smell filled the air with something that felt cleaner than time. When Daisy accidentally scraped her knee on a garden stake, Ayanna washed it with cooled tea from boiled leaves and wrapped it with her handmade cloth. "You'll be fine," Ayanna said gently, smoothing the wrap over the girl's leg. "This herb listens to pain." "No, plants don't listen," Jimmy said automatically. Ayanna looked up at him, her gaze calm but direct. "Then why do they grow towards your voice?" The boy blinked, speechless. Daisy giggled, then leaned against Ayanna's arm, It was a small, instinctive movement, but Ayanna didn't flinch. From the window, Wyatt watched the whole thing unfold. He had paused mid-hammer, a half-driven nail still stuck into the new porch frame he was repairing. His eyes settled on the three of them, Daisy nestled close, Jimmy furrowing his brow as he helped grind a new batch of roots. They weren't just playing, they were learning, they were healing. And Ayanna, her presence wasn't heavy or foreign anymore. She fit, like water in the cracks of dry earth. That evening, Jimmy came into the house with a jar of the salve they had made. He placed it on the table in front of Wyatt, cleared his throat. She says this one helps with sore muscles. Wyatt looked at the jar, then at his son. You believe her? Jimmy nodded. She knows stuff, real stuff, like Mama did. The word hung in the air between them, sacred and painful. Wyatt picked up the jar and opened the lid. The scent was earthy and calming. Something inside him, some ancient knot, loosened just a little. Later, as dusk settled in and fireflies blinked across the prairie, Ayanna sat by the steps of the house. Daisy leaned against her side, fast asleep. Jimmy sat nearby, playing with a carved wooden horse. Wyatt stepped outside, holding a tin mug of warm water steeped with mint. He held it out to her. For the healer, he said quietly. Ayanna took it, her eyes meeting his. I'm not a healer, she replied. He shook his head. You're healing all of us, whether you know it or not. She looked down at the children, at the garden bathed in moonlight, at the land that had once rejected her, now slowly embracing her. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. Then Wyatt also came. He said nothing, just left a full bucket of well water beside the garden. He never saw her use it, but every evening the bucket would be empty, and the soil would be dark, moist. It was a wordless agreement, a silent partnership for this small, hopeful plot of land. The soil began to soften under her hands. Every day, Wyatt would change his route home, just to pass by the garden, to see its slow, miraculous transformation. He told himself it was foolish, that nothing could grow there anymore. But a part of him, a part he thought had long died, felt a little anticipation. The garden began to become an invisible bridge, connecting two different worlds, a world of pain and a world of healing. It was a place where Ayanna found a purpose, and Wyatt found a reason for hope. One evening, at the dinner table, the silence was no longer heavy. It was replaced by a different kind of silence, a silence of familiarity, of acceptance. Wyatt watched his children eat, then looked at Ayanna sitting across from him. Her eyes were no longer empty, but held a spark of life, of resilience. He cleared his throat. Thank you, he said, his voice dry but sincere. Ayanna nodded, a slight smile on her lips. He didn't just give her a home, he gave her a chance. And she, in turn, gave him a reason to open his heart again. Their relationship wasn't love. It was empathy, respect, and compassion. It was the realization that two lonely souls could find each other, even in the silence of the wilderness. Daisy's small hand, with its dirt-stained fingers, reached out and held the rusty trowel tightly. The trowel had been in the shed for years, a forgotten relic of the garden. But in that moment, it wasn't an old tool. It was a bridge. Ayanna looked into the little girl's big, serious eyes. She didn't say anything, but a silent understanding passed between them. Ayanna gently took the trowel, her fingers brushing Daisy's in a fleeting moment. It was their first physical contact, a brief but meaningful moment. Wyatt stood watching from a distance. He felt a strange pang in his chest. It wasn't anger, but a more complex emotion, surprise, and a sense of relief. Then Jimmy, a boy who was always shy and calm, also came forward. He didn't have a toy or tool, just a handful of dried seeds he'd found in the shed. The boy opened his palm and gave them to Ayanna. She looked at the seeds, then into the boy's eyes. She nodded, a solemn, respectful nod. That's when the wall of silence they had built for so long crumbled. The children had done something Wyatt hadn't had the courage to do. They had invited her into their world, and by doing so, they had also opened a door for him. That evening, dinner proceeded as usual, but there was no longer the suffocating atmosphere. The air felt lighter. Ayanna sat across from Wyatt, her fingers still stained with dirt. Her eyes, once filled with emptiness, now held a hint of light. Wyatt, still a man of few words, no longer avoided her gaze. He looked at her, at little Daisy whispering something to Jimmy, and he knew that their lives had changed. After dinner, when the children were asleep, Wyatt sat alone on the porch, lighting a cigarette. The night air was cool, but he didn't feel cold. He saw Ayanna come out of the small shack and walk to the garden. She knelt down, gently burying the seeds Jimmy had given her. It was an ancient ritual, performed with a reverence he had never seen. He watched her fingers, gentle and careful, as if she were healing a person's wounds. Wyatt remembered Eleanor. She had loved this garden too. She had used it to grow herbs, to heal the people of the town. Her death had turned the garden into a grave. But now, Ayanna, in some way, was bringing it back to life. He stood up and walked toward her. He didn't say anything, just stood behind her. Ayanna wasn't surprised. She continued her work. Their mother loved this place, Wyatt said, his voice low and raspy. She grew flowers and herbs for medicine. A fever took her life. Ayanna stopped. She looked up at him. "I know," she whispered. "The herbs told me." He didn't understand. He couldn't understand how she spoke of nature as an old friend. But he didn't ask. He just stood there, listening to the wind carrying the rustle of dry leaves. A connection had been established, transcending language and culture, an understanding between two people who had once lived in loneliness. And then Ayanna said her name. Ayanna. The name, heard for the first time in the house, was not a plea. It was a declaration, a reclamation. In that moment, she was no longer the debt or a ghost. She was a human being, with a story and a name. His spoon stopped mid-air. The name Ayanna sounded strange, but as he looked at her, he realized that it also sounded like home. One afternoon, as the Arizona sky was stained a bruised purple-gray, a sign of an impending storm, the air was heavy, unnaturally still, as if the universe was holding its breath. The sound of Wyatt's horse's hooves on the dry ground broke the silence. He was returning, covered in sweat and dust. The small garden, now green with the first shoots, was the first thing that caught his eye, and a slight smile played on his lips. But the smile vanished abruptly. In the distance, a figure on horseback was approaching. It was not a friend. He recognized the man's posture, along with his cruel, sneering smile. It was Kane Thorne, the vulture, who had returned. This time, he didn't come to trade. He came to collect a debt. A cold feeling ran down Wyatt's spine. He sensed danger, and all the instincts of a sheriff who had been dormant for so long re-emerged. He turned back, looking at the house. Ayanna was standing at the window, her hands still stained with soil. Her eyes no longer held their initial fear, but a look of worry. Wyatt clenched his fists, then ordered the children into the house. "Get inside," he said in a low, decisive, authoritative voice. "Stay in there until I tell you to come out." Ayanna came out, standing behind him, her face pale but her eyes firm. Kane dismounted, walking with a deliberate stride, like a vulture approaching a carcass. He glanced over the clean house, the lush green garden, and a malicious grin spread across his face. "You look very happy," he said, his eyes fixed on Ayanna. "Your mother found you a good husband, but unfortunately, a better deal has come along. A wealthy man in California wants a Cheyenne woman for his wife. You'll live a more luxurious life." Every word Kane said was like a knife stabbing into Wyatt's heart. He didn't just want to take Ayanna back. He wanted to destroy what he and she had built. He wanted to steal the peace, the healing, and all the good things that had sprouted in this home. Wyatt stood still, his hands clenched into fists. "She's not for sale," he growled. Kane Thorne laughed loudly. "Of course she is. I bought her. She's my property." The word property made Wyatt's blood boil. In that moment, all the pain and anger that had been suppressed in his heart erupted. He remembered the day Kane Thorne brought Ayanna, how he talked about her like she was a piece of merchandise. He remembered his mocking words about Eleanor, about her death, and he realized that Kane Thorne wasn't just a debt collector. He was a demon who had come to destroy everything. "She is not property," Wyatt said, each word a growl. "She's a human being. She's Ayanna, and this is her home." Kane Thorne said nothing, just laughed loudly, then moved closer to Ayanna. He intended to touch her, but before he could, Wyatt lunged at him like a storm. The sheriff had vanished, replaced by a warrior fighting to protect what he held dear. The fight was short and brutal. Wyatt didn't use a gun. He used his bare hands, his strength to defeat his enemy. Every punch he threw carried with it the pain, the anger, and the love he felt for Ayanna. When the storm subsided, Kane Thorne was lying on the ground, a trail of blood flowing from his mouth. He was terrified, not expecting Wyatt to be so strong. Wyatt roared, "Get out! Don't ever come back here. She doesn't belong to you. She belongs here." Kane Thorne scrambled onto his horse, not daring to look back. He rode off into the descending night. Wyatt remained standing there, his hands trembling and stained with blood. The first drops of rain began to fall, washing away the dust and blood into the earth. That night, after the rain stopped and the sky calmed into a dark hush, Wyatt built a small fire behind the house. He didn't know why, except that he didn't want to go inside just yet. Ayanna sat on the ground nearby, holding a dried sprig of rosemary between her fingers. Her face was quiet, but her hands trembled faintly from the adrenaline that hadn't worn off. Wyatt tossed a cracked piece of wood into the fire. "That old shed over there," he said, nodding toward the crooked structure by the fence line, "used to be where Eleanor dried herbs. She had this idea of turning it into an apothecary, never got to finish it." Ayanna looked at the shed. "You loved her deeply." "Still do," he replied without shame. "Reckon I always will." She nodded. "I once loved a healer, a Cheyenne man. He tried to save a settler child from fever. They shot him anyway." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, the smoke rising like memories you can't stop from surfacing. Then she held out the rosemary, dropped it into the flames. "He used to say plants carry memory. You burn the past to make room for roots." Wyatt stared at the fire for a long time. The next morning, he cleared out the shed not to erase what had been, but to make space for something that could still be. "I have received your request. After the dramatic climax in Chapter 4, I will write the final chapter, Chapter 5, to bring the story to a fulfilling conclusion. This chapter will focus on the healing and the new normal for the characters." The storm raged outside. Rain poured down, and the wind howled through every crack in the house, like a final lament of the past. But inside, in the soft, golden glow of a single oil lamp, a new sense of peace had been found. Wyatt walked into the house, soaked and weary after his confrontation with Kane Thorne. He was no longer a man besieged by pain. He was a warrior who had just won, and now he was simply a man. Ayanna was waiting for him. She said nothing, but her actions spoke for themselves. She had prepared a basin of warm water, a clean cloth, and a tin of salve, placing them on the old wooden table. As Wyatt sat down, she gently took his hands, her fingers touching the bruises and cuts. Her hands were not trembling. She worked with a calm, decisive manner, as if she were accustomed to tending to life's wounds. In that quiet moment, Wyatt truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the resilience in her eyes, the compassion in every gesture. She wasn't a woman who needed to be saved. She was a partner, a companion. Their bond wasn't a debt, but a choice. He had chosen her, and she had chosen to stay. "Thank you," he whispered, the words rough on his lips, like pebbles. She simply nodded, a small, sad smile appearing on her lips for the first time, like a wildflower blooming in the desert. That night, the storm washed everything away. It washed away the dust, the blood, and the ghosts of the past. It swept away all the pain and fear. The next morning, the world felt reborn. The sun rose into a clear, cloudless sky. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. Wyatt woke up feeling like a new man. He went out to the garden, and the sight before him stunned him. Ayanna, Jimmy, and Daisy were in the garden. It was now green and vibrant with the first shoots. The rain had nourished it, helping it come back to life. Wyatt looked at Ayanna, And he realized that she hadn't just planted flowers. She had sown hope in the soil, and the earth had responded with new life. He walked closer, his hand hovering before he gently placed it on her shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration. "This is your home," he said, his voice filled with sincerity and love. "And this is your family." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes sparkling like dewdrops. A smile bloomed on her lips, no longer a sad smile, but a smile of happiness and peace. They stood side by side, the quiet cowboy and the woman named Ayanna, two lonely souls who had found their home not on a map, but in each other. Spring came early that year. The rain had done its work, and now the sun seemed gentler, less like a punishment, and more like a promise. The garden Ayanna had coaxed from dust had started to bloom not with roses or lilies, but with stubborn, useful plants, mint, sage, wild chamomile. They grew where once nothing had dared to try. The garden, once a graveyard of memory, was now breathing again. Ayanna knelt beside the plot, showing Daisy how to pinch back mint leaves. The girl grimaced at the smell, then sniffed again, curious. "Mama used to rub this on my temples when I had headaches," she whispered. She didn't say whose mama. Jimmy crouched near the edge, holding a jar of seeds. "You know what this is?" Ayanna asked him gently. He shrugged. "It's echinacea," she said. "It fights sickness, just like courage does." That afternoon, Wyatt fixed up the swing that hung from the old oak tree. He hadn't touched it since Eleanor's passing. He oiled the rope, tested the plank, and didn't say a word when the children climbed on together. Their laughter didn't sting anymore. It sounded like rain in a dry land. Later that night, Wyatt sat on the porch plucking a banjo. His fingers were clumsy, the tune rough, but it was music. Ayanna hummed along quietly. No lyrics, just a shared rhythm. Something soft and new. They didn't speak of love, didn't speak of the past. They didn't need to. The swing creaked in the breeze. The garden rustled. The stars blinked gently above. And in a land known for ghosts and grit, one little ranch stood quietly, blooming again. They had found Wild West love, and their love story would be told for generations as one of the best Wild West stories ever heard. Their Western stories, one of cowboy love stories, had healed not only their hearts but a barren piece of land.